From Washington, D.C., the CBS television network presents Washington Report. Here is Chief Washington correspondent David Schoenbrunn.
Nikita Khrushchev today did precisely what President Kennedy has been asking him to do ever since this crisis began. He ordered the dismantling of Soviet missile bases in Cuba under United Nations supervision and the return of the rockets to the Soviet Union. And he dropped the demand he made only 24 hours earlier for the dismantling of NATO missile bases in Turkey in return. Khrushchev made his decision known in a letter to the president. The letter has shortly before been received at the White House this morning, but only after its text had already been publicly broadcast by Radio Moscow. Strange as it seems, the President of the United States, like any ordinary citizen, learned of Khrushchev's decision from a radio broadcast. Translators are now busy that they've gotten the official text, and they're working on it now. Its language is quite extraordinary. Nothing like this has ever been seen since the start of the Cold War. Indeed, not since America and Russia were allies against Germany has a Soviet leader written in such warm and friendly terms to an American president. Esteemed Mr. President, the letter begins, I have received your message of 27th October 1962. I express my satisfaction and gratitude for the sense of proportion and the understanding of the responsibility borne by you at present for the preservation of peace throughout the whole world, which you have shown. I understand very well your anxiety and the anxiety of the people of the United States in connection with the fact that the weapons which you describe as offensive are, in fact, grim weapons. Both you and I understand what kind of weapons they are. Then Khrushchev got on to announce his order for the dismantling of the bases and the return of the rockets. The letter was not completely without some protest, but not in the usual harsh words. Khrushchev complains of raids in Cuba by refugee groups. He also claims that an American plane has flown over western Siberia near Alaska. But even these complaints are expressed more in sorrow than in anger. President Kennedy has read the official translation and has replied. He went to church this morning, as usual, but under very different circumstances from last Sunday, when he had just taken the fateful decision to impose a quarantine on Cuba. Immediately after church services, the president met with members of the National Security Council's Executive Committee. They've been evaluating Khrushchev's apparent capitulation all morning. They've been searching for its meaning and what the next step should be by us as the president was in church. Despite the good news today, all officials do remain cautious in their comments, and air surveillance of Cuba is continuing, as is the general alert posture of all American forces at home and abroad. But we have nonetheless heard satisfaction here, and the first official word from the president came just a short time ago from his press secretary, Pierre Salinger.
The following is the text of President Kennedy's statement of noon. I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them to the Soviet Union under UN verification. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace. We shall be in touch with the Secretary General of the United Nations with respect to reciprocal measures to assure peace in the Caribbean area. It is my earnest hope that the governments of the world can, with a solution to the Cuban crisis, turn their urgent attention to the compelling necessity for ending the arms race and reducing world tension. This applies to the military confrontation between the Warsaw Pact and NATO countries, as well as to other situations in other parts of the world where tensions lead to the wasteful diversion of resources to weapons of war.
That's the word from the White House. Let's switch now to another nerve center of government during this crisis, the Pentagon, and CBS News correspondent Neil Strauzer.
There is no relaxation yet here at the Pentagon. The spokesman says as far as he knows, our aerial surveillance of those missile sites continues. There has been no relaxation of the activities we have been carrying on. Those activities included the call-up last night of 24 troop carrier squadrons of the Air Force Reserve. Preparations, said Defense Secretary McNamara, for any eventuality. This morning, Assistant Secretary of Defense Sylvester said speculation on whether further military action had been imminent could be nothing except very dangerous and harmful to our country. We wait for the definite information that Khrushchev is carrying out his word and sending those missiles home. This is Neil Strasser at the Pentagon.
That's the word from our military command post. Let's find out now what's happening in the diplomatic area, which should become even more important now as we switch to our United Nations correspondent, Richard C. Hottelet. Come back to me. We seem to be having some difficulty raising United Nations correspondent Richard C. Hottelet. This is the kind of day it has been. People have been awakened early this morning, brought in at this extraordinary news, and we've been sending telegrams out all around the world. We hope to be getting our Moscow correspondent and our Rio correspondent. Perhaps the control room can tell me whether or not Moscow is ready for the phone call while we're waiting for the United Nations. Maybe we can get to Russia faster than we can get to New York City. Does anybody in the control room know whether Moscow is standing by? Hello, Calb, are you there in Moscow?
David, this is Moscow standing by.
Well, we're glad to get to you. We hope to get to the United Nations after you. Marvin, one thing seems to be quite sure this morning, as we see it from Washington, and that is that Khrushchev has capitulated. But we wondered whether or not you see it that way in Moscow.
David, I would say that the flavor of capitulation is all over the Soviet capital tonight. From the very tone of the Khrushchev letter, from the tone of Moscow radio and television broadcast tonight, you get the feeling that the Soviet government has backed down all the way, and many observers who have spent a long time around here really cannot recall a time when the Kremlin has backed off an issue so quickly and really so abjectly.
Marvin, from Moscow at this moment, what else can you tell us that you think we ought to be informed on in this moment?
David, a couple of things. First, you know, in this letter to the president today, Khrushchev made no mention of Berlin whatever. And the whole line at the moment is one of extreme caution here. And I think that although there might be the tendency in the Western world, maybe later today, maybe tomorrow, to rejoice, I would think that there are some basic questions which are raised here, and the most important one so far is the impact that this backdown might have on the political leadership of this country. Just how firm can Khrushchev keep control of the situation after having looked so bad in the last couple of days? Not only Khrushchev himself, but the entire leadership in the Kremlin now.
Well, I can assure you, Marvin, that nobody in the United States yet is rejoicing. Certainly in the nation's capital, there's a feeling of caution, moderation. It's very sober. Nobody is crowing victory. Nothing like that over here at all. Marvin, thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to add from Moscow?
No, David. I just hope that the lines of communication remain open and real clear.
They're excellent. We got to you. We're still waiting on New York, and we're waiting on Rio de Janeiro, too. We're hoping that we're going to be getting our correspondent, Charles Carroll, to see what this means in Latin America. Maybe the control room can tell me what is coming up now. Have we got New York? Do we have Rio? Yes, we have Rio, and we hope, I suppose, one day to get New York. Hello, Charlie Carroll. Are you there in Rio de Janeiro? Charles, I'm told you're standing by in Rio. Can you hear me? Come in, please, Rio. Well, we're going to stand by for Rio and New York City, but first we're going to talk to some people. Republican of Pennsylvania, and Senator Kenneth Keating, Republican of New York. Roger Mudd.
Gentlemen, you're the first Republicans we've had a chance to talk to this morning since the developments from Moscow. You both have long spoken out on the Cuban crisis. Senator Keating, were you startled by the day's developments?
Well, I was not startled, but of course I was pleased and gratified by them. It is a reaction to a policy of firmness which the president has taken, which is usually expected from tyrants or dictators. I think we must have a wary, restrained optimism under these circumstances. It's very important that our surveillance continue. It's very important that we have inspection teams in there as rapidly as possible. We have known in the past of Soviet perfidy. We know that they have told our government falsehoods about the existence of these missile bases. Of course, this is a confession of their past perfidy, indeed. We must also watch very carefully for some move elsewhere, because that is the typical communist tactic, to concentrate all attention on one point and then move somewhere else. I applaud the President's firmness in this matter, and certainly he will have all of the Congress back of him, I'm sure.
Senator Scott, what part has the Republican Party played in the development of this Cuban showdown?
Well, I'm very proud that the Republican Party has shown its responsibility as a party, has demonstrated that it can be trusted. I'm very proud that it took the lead 2 months ago in giving warning of these things, and Senator Keating and I were saying then that Cuba is not worth a war to Khrushchev. We were making the point that the OAS would support the United States. We were urging a blockade, and we were urging the convening of the OAS. The Republicans, in my judgment, by their firm attitude of immediate action, helped greatly in fixing the climate of readiness for action in Cuba. And when the President went out to make some speeches, I'm sure that he found the people generally were demanding action. And when he came back, he took that action, which all Americans applaud, and we applaud especially the results so far as they've come in. We've always believed that Khrushchev would back down. General Clay used to say that if you ask the Russians to stop doing something, they keep on doing it. And he said that on my program last summer. And then he made the further point, but if you do something yourself, the Russians will stop what they are doing. And this has happened, apparently. Now, I'm glad that when the President arrived at the gates of decision, that he found the responsible Republican Party, leadership and rank and file, waiting at those gates, ready to go through them with him. And I think that this demonstration of responsibility by both parties is clear warning to Khrushchev that we act first as Americans, and we have high hopes that this dismantling will take place immediately. And I agree with Senator Keating that we should be sure that the two teams go in as soon as possible, and we should watch for Khrushchev to make some other move elsewhere in the world. But it does look as if we caught Khrushchev with his plans down this time.
Thank you both, Senator Scott and Senator Keating. Paul Niven is here now with House Democratic Whip Hale Boggs.
Congressman Boggs, as Democratic Whip in the House, how do you react to Khrushchev's message today?
Well, I'd like to react first as an American, Paul, and secondly as a Democratic Whip. Just as David said, all of us are reacting, I would say, with a great restraint and moderation. If this is as it appears to be, it of course represents a very significant victory for the United States of America. And it means that we emerge again as a strong leader of the whole free world. It also, in my judgment, redounds to the great credit of the President of the United States, who has shown courage and unflinching determination throughout this week of tension and crisis. I can't believe that the Russians would have backed down unless they fully appreciated the fact that the President of the United States meant business. And I must agree, too, with Senators Keating and Scott in the fact that both political parties supported the President of the United States and the leaders of the United States in this period of crisis. I would think there's one other thing, and that is that the posture of Russia is greatly changed as a result of the events of the past week. I would also think that charges relative to my party being soft on communism now have a very hollow ring indeed.
Congressman, what will the effect be on the November 6th election?
Well, that's hard to say. I think that President Kennedy emerges as a very strong, forceful leader of our country. Whether or not this rubs off in contest is one that I'm not prepared to judge. I would say that insofar as the incumbent members of Congress are concerned, all of them who have taken a strong position on Cuba, whether they be Republicans or Democrats, will benefit. I would think the overall impact, and again, I want to emphasize the fact that this is not a political matter, would be generally good for the Democratic Party.
Thank you, Congressman Boggs. Now here again is David Schoenberg.
We have a word from the control room now. New York City is ready. Let's switch now to our UN correspondent, Richard C. Hottelet.
United Nations are delighted, shocked, or still disbelieving at what one of them called the greatest diplomatic defeat the Soviet Union has suffered since the Cold War began. The Cubans here are not available for comment, and the Soviets are saying nothing before First Deputy Premier V.V. Kuznetsov arrives in New York this evening. U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson this morning saw Secretary General U Thant for an hour, and the next move may well take place at the United Nations. With the basic agreement apparently reached on UN supervision to guarantee the end of the Cuban threat, it now remains to work out the details, and this will probably happen in further private talks here very soon, with the United States, Russia, and Cuba sitting down together for the first time. The UN Secretariat is already at work sketching out the shape and conditions of the UN presence. With Castro's invitation and Khrushchev's agreement, the UN is thought not even to need an official mandate from the Security Council for the preliminary arrangements. The work of preparation is not difficult. The United Nations has intervened a dozen times over the past 16 years to help keep the peace in Greece, Kashmir, Korea, the Middle East, and in the Congo, among others. It has the machinery and the experience to act quickly in this case. But optimism at the UN has not got out of hand. Adlai Stevenson said this morning he had no evidence that the work on the Soviet missile bases had stopped in Cuba, and the United States is making it plain in every conversation that there is not a minute to waste. This is Richard C. Hottelet, United Nations.
The crisis through which we have been living and hearing about began behind closed doors at 10 o'clock on the night of Monday, the 15th of October, when an intelligence report was handed to Secretary of Defense McNamara, who took one look at the pictures and the analysis it contained and reached for the phone to call the State Department. The report had indicated a Soviet missile base operation in Cuba, and the Defense Secretary wanted to know urgently just what intelligence State had on latest Russian intentions. Russian experts at the State Department pointed out instantly that this was an abrupt, alarming departure from Soviet practice. Never before had the Soviets put even one single missile outside their own borders, not even in their own tightly controlled satellite states. Russian secretiveness and mistrust of all foreigners, including communists, were absolute. Now suddenly we found the Russians setting up bases very far from their own borders in a most unreliable country susceptible to spying and sabotage. The experts feared that Khrushchev must have had extraordinary reasons to depart so abruptly from Soviet tradition. The analyses went on all through that Monday night. Then, at 9 o'clock the next morning, the evidence was laid on the desk of the President of the United States. President Kennedy acted instantly, calling for a meeting of his most trusted colleagues, the men who have since become the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. They met with the President at 11:45 a.m. Tuesday morning, October 16th, and continued to meet all through the week in the most successfully secret conclave ever held in this open city. They used many devices to throw observers, including their own staffs, off the trail. Most of the meetings, outside the White House that is, were held in Undersecretary of State George Ball's conference room. One day, there were 12 huge Cadillacs parked out in front of State Department, and someone suddenly realized that this was attracting attention. An aide rushed out to disperse the cars, and the men were told to come to work henceforth in the smallest, oldest cars that they could find. George Ball had to keep his Cadillac to shuttle some of the inner circle back and forth from State Department to White House. And he recalls one trip in which there were 10 men in his car, with cabinet members sitting piled on top of cabinet members. During that tense week, these men considered every possible move, from protest at the UN to invasion of Cuba. And they considered every possible Soviet countermove, from Berlin to Vietnam to nuclear war itself. Every risk was calculated and faced. Arguments sometimes grew heated, and the President himself joined in the arguments, prodding, probing, provoking his advisors to speak bluntly and fully. And for the first time, they broke with government tradition, and each man spoke as an individual. No interdepartmental meetings were held to establish a State Department or Defense Department line. Each man spoke for himself, with a sense of national survival at stake. Several of these men to whom I've talked this week tell me it was the most awesome experience of their lives. and these are men who've seen almost every kind of crisis in war and in peace. Towards the middle of the week, the idea of some kind of blockade began to emerge as the best bet. By Saturday, the president felt it was the right move. It was tough, and we had to show our steel. But it was not aggressive, and we had to show our coolness. It was aimed at the real, the equal adversary, Soviet power, not little Cuba. The water was a perfect first testing ground because American naval strength is greater than the Soviets. By Sunday morning, the president decided this was it, and he gave the orders to put what he was then to call the quarantine into effect. Now the inner circle had to open outwards, the world had to be informed, and secret directives were given to the USIA to prepare global broadcasts. The State Department had to put into code messages to our ambassadors around the world to inform them so that at the right moment they could inform foreign governments. In the midst of all this rush and tension, some men's tempers tightened, but others brought their sense of humor into play, such as the coding official who rejected all the abracadabras and selected the single word, go, as the code word. Secret messages were also sent to congressional leaders, and these provided some of the lighter moments of an otherwise tense week. Democratic Congressman Hale Boggs, whom we've just met, will never forget his experience last week.
Well, David, I may have been one of the first ones called, but I suspect I was one of the last ones located, because I was 30 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico on a boat. About that time, a plane started circling, an Air Force plane, and came right down. I looked down, and a message was ejected bottle was ejected from the plane, and we fished it out of the water. It took us a little while. By this time, everybody was quite tense. And this bottle had a message in it. It was a plastic bottle and was floating on the sea, and we were so nervous we couldn't get it out. We had to cut it open with a knife. And this was a message. Shall I read it?
Yes, please.
It says to Congressman Hale Boggs aboard the Cayuga. Call operator 18, Washington, Larry O'Brien. Urgent message from the president. Incidentally, when I got the message out of the bottle, I was quite relieved in that at least it wasn't a family emergency, which at first I thought it may be. This is the way we think. You know, all of us think this way. We think first about our own folks.
Well, we're thinking things look a little bit better today than they did to Mr. Boggs last Monday when they fished him out of the Gulf of Mexico. But there still does remain many perils around the world to us and to other nations. There's a war front that's going on now that perhaps should not be forgotten, and that is the conflict between India and the other communist power, the Chinese. We asked our correspondent, Robert Pierpoint, to speak with the Indian ambassador here, B.K. Nehru. Let's now switch to Robert Pierpoint.
Mr. Ambassador, as you know, the American people have for the last several days been so preoccupied with the Cuban crisis that perhaps we have missed some of the important things that seem to be going on in your country. What is the situation in the India-China dispute?
Mr. Pierpoint, the situation in the India-China dispute is very bad. The Cuban crisis has not yet resulted in hostilities, and one hopes it never will. But in India, the situation is that India has actually been invaded, and we are invaded in force, and we are in a state of undeclared war with China. Hostilities started a few days ago. They have been continuous. Our forces have had to fall back, and we're fighting all the time. So that here is a crisis, a war already in operation, although still undeclared.
Mr. Ambassador, the other day you came to President Kennedy with a note from Prime Minister Nehru, and now the Prime Minister has indicated that he has asked a number of countries for help, presumably the United States included. What type of help would you like to have?
Mr. Pierpoint, what the Prime Minister has asked for in his letter to President Kennedy, as to other heads of friendly nations, is at this moment sympathy and support, an understanding of our situation, not only by the governments but by the peoples. The peoples are important in democracies, and certainly they're important in the United States. A sympathetic understanding of our case, and support, such support as we may need from time to time. Now, there has been no specific request for any kind of concrete support so far, but it's obvious that we are going to need arms and equipment of various kinds, and we are already taking steps to buy these. We bought some well, this is a continuous process, but we've accelerated it. We have bought some in the United Kingdom. We're buying some in Canada. And we have a mission here actually trying to expedite the dispatch of spare parts and things for American equipment which we already have. I don't know whether you're aware that quite a lot of our equipment comes from this country, is being bought in this country. And we continuously need spare parts and things to maintain it.
As yet, you have not asked, then, for more American military equipment.
We have not as yet asked specifically for more American military equipment.
But you imply that you feel you may have to.
We have to get more equipment. And if the United States is in a position to supply that equipment, I'm sure we will have to buy it from here as well as from elsewhere.
Do you see or foresee any need for foreign troops like American troops to help out?
Not at all. We have a good army, and we have a reasonably large army. It's only 1/7 the size, roughly, of the Chinese army, but the whole of the Chinese army is fortunately not in India.
Not yet.
Not yet. It's not likely to be, because the Himalayas are still a very strong defense, and you really can't cross the Himalayas in very large force. But to deal with the Chinese invasion, we have quite sufficient troops. What we don't have is sufficient equipment. The Chinese are better armed, better equipped, and this is one of the reasons why we have to fall back. And the terrain in the area we're fighting now is in favor of the Chinese. As they come a little more forward, I think they'll lose that advantage, and we'll be able to hold them back. But foreign troops are entirely unnecessary in India.
Well, perhaps there's a lesson to be drawn from all of these crises. The crisis of India, our own crisis, the way we feel today. Everybody's feeling very much better today, and last week everybody was very frightened. Perhaps we didn't have as much reason to be frightened, or perhaps not as much reason to be feeling better. There are many problems in the world today. They should be looked at soberly and from the perspective of history itself, to remember where we were in order to understand where we're going. And this is a weekend, for example, of two anniversaries that Americans might want to remember. On October 27th, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson made a very important speech about human rights and national integrity, and he said, "The United States will never again seek an additional foot of territory by conquest." Wilson was promising that we would not be aggressive. That sounds strange to Americans, but he was talking about what was then known as dollar diplomacy. And there's another anniversary, too, that has very great meaning for all Americans today. On the 28th of October, in the year 1886, the Statue of Liberty, enlightening the world, a gift of France to the United States, was unveiled in New York Harbor. And now, good day from Washington Report.
The preceding program was produced under the supervision and control of CBS News. Portions of the program were pre-recorded. CBS News will present a report on later developments in the Cuban crisis this afternoon at 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
A CBS News special report, Anatomy of a Crisis.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Collingwood. This is the day we have every reason to believe when the world came out from under the most terrible threat of nuclear holocaust since the end of World War II. During the next half hour, we'll examine the events that led to the break in the crisis that came suddenly this morning in Moscow. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced that Russian missile bases in Cuba would be dismantled, freighted, and shipped back to the Soviet Union. The message was couched in language that was extraordinarily conciliatory. Khrushchev said that he is acting now to liquidate with greater speed the dangerous conflict, to serve the cause of peace, to give confidence to all peoples longing for peace. First Deputy Foreign Minister Vasily Kuznetsov is on his way to the United Nations to work out the settlement. Khrushchev proposed wide-ranging negotiations to follow. In Washington, Mr. Kennedy's reaction was swift and favorable. Part of what he said in a statement that Khrushchev's offer was important and constructive as a contribution to peace. Part of that, his official reply, released only minutes ago, was read by News Secretary Pierre Salinger.
I think that you and I, with our heavy responsibilities for the maintenance of peace, were aware that developments were approaching a point where events could have become unmanageable. So I welcome this message and consider it an important contribution to peace. The distinguished efforts of the Acting Secretary General U Tant have greatly facilitated both of our tasks. I consider my letter to you of October 27th and your reply of today as firm undertakings on the part of both of our governments which should be promptly carried out. I hope that the necessary measures can be at once taken through the United Nations, as your message says, so that the United States in turn will be able to remove the quarantine measures now in effect.
As friendly as was Khrushchev's message, there were some notes of asperity, notably a complaint about another U-2 overflight for which the president expressed regret. Fidel Castro made a statement today in which he said he would not go along with this apparent solution of the present crisis unless we give up our naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. But neither Russia nor the United States is worrying much about Castro today. Even so, U Thant, Acting Secretary General of the United Nations, has accepted Castro's invitation and is going to Cuba on Tuesday to help speed settlement of the crisis. We'll be back with the anatomy of a crisis in a moment after this message. Last, the world first learned of the crisis from the President of the United States.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
At those missile bases, Adlai Stevenson told the United Nations, are mobile weapons identical with the 1,000-mile missiles which have been displayed in Moscow parades.
Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote.
If the president already had the evidence of Soviet missile bases in Cuba when he talked with Gromyko, why then did he not bring it up at their meeting? Ambassador Zorin asked the same question of Adlai Stevenson at the UN. Stevenson had an answer.
And you asked with a fine show of indignation why the president didn't tell Mr. Gromyko on last Thursday about our evidence. Well, I'll tell you why. Because we were assembling the evidence, and perhaps it would be instructive to the world to see how a Soviet official, how far he would go in perfidy.
It was Thursday, October 18th, that the president saw Andrei Gromyko. The next day, he flew to Illinois on a political errand, lending his weight to the Democratic cause in that state. He did not mention Cuba in his speeches. Time magazine reported contemptuously, Cuba might as well have been on another planet. Then he suddenly returned to Washington. A cold was the excuse. Now we know why he came back, to plan the move against Soviet bases in Cuba. But why did he wait so long? Had something happened that hadn't happened when he saw Gromyko, when he went off stump speaking in Illinois? Was there some sudden, dramatic development behind the scenes? Let's ask CBS News chief Washington correspondent David Schoenbrunn.
When the president left Washington for the campaign tour, the best intelligence had not yet demonstrated that these bases under study had become operable. And the president decided to go to the hustings for maximum secrecy and public calm because the kind of decision that he was facing can best be made without pressure. But he asked his principal aides to keep on analyzing reconnaissance pictures and to let him know the moment that any definite new conclusion became apparent. By dawn on Saturday, technicians reported a real danger that the bases might become operable rapidly, and the president, apprised of this, came right back to Washington. A few days later, last Tuesday, October 23rd to be exact, new low-level pictures came in, and they've just been released today. This one was the conclusive confirmation of the earlier analysis that had brought the president back to Washington. This is a site at San Cristobal showing fuel tank trailers, oxidizers, a missile shelter tent, and an erector under canvas. Missiles that can reach Washington were rapidly being set up at this base. That's why the president came back.
Congressional leaders were recalled from their campaign labors, flown back to Washington in military planes, and there were reports of troop movements in the Florida Keys. At noon on Monday, the president announced he would speak to the nation that evening. The State Department began briefing friendly ambassadors in relays. Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson flew to Europe to inform NATO. The air of crisis was unmistakable. But did it concern Cuba, or possibly Berlin, or even India? At 7 o'clock that night, the world learned that it concerned the Soviet missile buildup in Cuba. President Kennedy revealed the decision that led to the most terrifying confrontation of the great powers since World War II.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The president made it plain that the United States would, if necessary, go beyond the naval quarantine.
Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities.
One eventuality, a nuclear attack. Mr. Kennedy grimly spelled out what we would do.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Thus, the president made Cuba squarely and unmistakably a matter between the United States and Russia. It was no longer a local dispute between the United States and Castro. From now on, Castro would be the forgotten man of the crisis. The confrontation was between the two great superpowers, the United States and Russia. What had made it so was the presence of medium-range missiles in Cuba and the preparation of sites for intermediate-range missiles which carry twice as far. The United States could brook the hirsute harangues of a Castro. It could not brook the presence of Soviet missiles capable of changing the whole balance of power. Although Russia has long-range missiles capable of reaching every part of the United States, it does not have enough of them to wipe out our retaliatory power. But the addition of medium and intermediate range weapons in Cuba would give Russia vastly more first strike power, enough perhaps to neutralize our ability to wipe out Russia in return. And it is this ability which is our deterrent. It was on the basis of such calculations involving the very essence of power that President Kennedy directly challenged the Soviet Union. The intricate moves of power and diplomacy which led to today's apparent Soviet disengagement after this message. The president's speech last Monday set off a complex and momentous train of events that is by no means concluded, despite today's promise by Khrushchev to dismantle the Russian missile sites. It was not until 13 hours after the president spoke, on the following day, Tuesday, that the Russians replied. They denounced the quarantine as piratical, but American officials detected even then a note of uncertainty and alarm in their response. Meanwhile, the countries of the Organization of American States unanimously endorsed and associated themselves with the United States action. The Security Council met in emergency session, and Adlai Stevenson warned that the United States was in deadly earnest.
We hope that Chairman Khrushchev has not made a miscalculation, that he has not mistaken forbearance for weakness. We cannot believe that he has deluded himself into supposing that though we have power, we lack nerve, that though we have weapons, we are without the will to use them.
By this time, an extraordinary American military buildup was underway. These Marine reinforcements flew into our naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. These forces were only a symbolic handful, but it was a military response that was unmistakable, an undeniable indication that we had power, that we did not lack nerve, that we had weapons, and that we did not lack the will to use them. The Pentagon became a command post, manned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara himself 24 hours a day. He announced the extension of Marine and Navy enlistments and answered questions about the quarantine at a news conference that was like a wartime briefing.
Can you tell us when the first intercept would be at hand if ships that are proceeding towards Cuba continue?
No, as I mentioned a moment ago, I can't predict the exact movements of either Soviet ships or U.S. vessels between now and the time that the quarantine becomes effective at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow. I can tell you, if it's of interest to you, that we believe there are about 25 Soviet ships moving toward Cuba, merchant ships. We believe that there are some 10 or 12 Soviet ships in Cuban ports. We believe that there are about 25 Soviet ships moving away from Cuba to return to their home ports.
Wednesday, the quarantine went into effect at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. There was some speculation whether that hour would be remembered in history as the moment that World War III began. Would Russian ships try to run the blockade, and would our Navy sink them? Obviously, this did not happen. Some Russian ships carrying weapons veered away to avoid contact. Next, an unexpected twist. Nikita Khrushchev answered an appeal from British pacifist Bertrand Russell, saying that he wanted a summit meeting with President Kennedy, a course of action greeted with no enthusiasm in Washington. At the United Nations, Acting Secretary General U Thant advanced a peace formula, defining it this way.
This involves, on the one hand, the voluntary suspension of all arms shipments to Cuba, and also the voluntary suspension of the quarantine measures involving the searching of ships bound for Cuba. I believe that such voluntary suspension for a period of 2 to 3 weeks will greatly ease the situation and give time to the parties concerned to meet and discuss with a view to finding a peaceful solution of the problem. In this context, I shall gladly make myself available to all parties for whatever services I may be able to perform.
Meanwhile, the Soviet ships still bound for Cuba were on an intercepting course with warships of the U.S. Navy's quarantining force. The first encounter came on Thursday morning. Assistant Secretary of Defense Arthur Sylvester made the announcement.
The first Russian ship that proceeded through the area patrolled by our Navy forces was a Soviet tanker. It was ascertained by the U.S. naval vessel which intercepted her that the tanker had only petroleum aboard. Since petroleum is not presently included as prohibited material under President Kennedy's proclamation setting up the quarantine, the tanker was allowed to proceed. The Navy satisfied itself that no prohibited material was aboard this particular ship. This encounter took place shortly after 8 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time today.
It was clear that, for the time being anyway, the Russians were not going to challenge the American blockade with any prohibited material. U Thant's proposal, with its implied condemnation of the U.S. quarantine, was the subject of much discussion among the President and his advisors that day. The Russians endorsed it at once. But the president, in the polite but ambiguous language of diplomacy, turned it down. While acknowledging the desirability of talks and negotiations, he brought the argument back to his crucial point. The Soviet missile bases in Cuba must be dismantled and their weapons rendered inoperable before there would be any talks. Their continued presence in Cuba was not negotiable. In the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson hammered away at the same point. The Russians still had not admitted that they had missiles in Cuba. Stevenson showed the UN aerial photographs. At one point, he and Zorin engaged in a revealing dialogue.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Я не нахожусь.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
World opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly.
I should like to say,
Продолжайте вашу речь, господин Стивенсон.
sir, will you please continue your statement? You will have your answer in due course.
Continue your statement, please. You will receive the answer in the due course. Do not worry.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
Zorin's silence reflected indecision, which seemed to have gripped Soviet policy. On Friday, the Navy intercepted another ship bound for Cuba, and finding its cargo harmless, passed it through. The Soviets were still unwilling to test our power at sea. The impression grew that perhaps they were backing off altogether. The president pledged that American warships would try to avoid direct contact for the next few days. But the crucial area of the conflict was not at sea, but on the island of Cuba itself, where the missiles and bases were. Friday night, the White House got evidence from there that made the situation all the graver.
There is no evidence to date indicating that there is any intention to dismantle or discontinue work on these missile sites. On the contrary, the Soviets are rapidly continuing their construction of missile support and launch facilities, and serious attempts are underway to camouflage their efforts.
Thereafter, a State Department spokesman grimly recalled President Kennedy's statement that if the work on the missile bases did not stop, further action would be justified, and it was clear that he did not mean diplomatic action. All this time, the deployment of U.S. military forces had been continuing under an only partially effective security blackout. Informed sources spoke openly of the possibility of invasion of Cuba. Pinpoint bombing of the missile sites themselves was also mentioned. But something else happened on Friday night, which we did not learn of until the following day. President Kennedy received a conciliatory personal letter from Premier Khrushchev proposing a Soviet evacuation of Cuba on terms that the United States could accept. It was so promising that the letter was kept secret until the president's reply had reached Moscow and Khrushchev had had a chance to react to it. But then on Saturday, only yesterday, Moscow radio announced a different Soviet proposal, a deal for the elimination of Russian bases in Cuba in exchange for the removal of American bases in Turkey. Once again, the United States refused to discuss it until the missile bases in Cuba were removed. The dismantling of the Turkish bases was another matter, would cause serious concern in NATO. Even though they're somewhat obsolete, they do have significant psychological value. This surprise introduction of the Turkish issue caused the White House to reveal Khrushchev's earlier letter and the president's reply. in the president's reply, he said that if the Russians did dismantle those missile bases under UN supervision, as we have demanded, then we would end the naval quarantine and give assurances against an invasion of Cuba. But the first thing that had to be done, said the president again, was the cessation of work on the bases. 90 miles away, on public beaches in Key West, a startling reminder that we meant what we said. Rockets, where days before there had been nothing but sun and sand. This just part of the Florida buildup that must have appeared so menacing to Khrushchev and Fidel Castro. And at the Defense Department, Sylvester announced a further military call-up.
I have instructed the Secretary of the Air Force to order to active duty 24 troop carrier squadrons of the Air Force Reserve with their associated support units. In accordance with that order, I issued instructions for the recall of 14,214 Air Force reservists.
That was how the situation stood when we went to bed last night. Khrushchev's response still ambiguous. The work on the Cuban Missile site still continuing as far as we knew. The American military buildup continuing. Then this morning came the startling and unexpected news that Premier Khrushchev had agreed to withdraw Soviet weapons and personnel from Cuba under UN supervision. The president had no more official verification of this at first than anyone else, and at first the White House reacted with extreme caution. Now, as we know, the president has accepted and replied in warm and moderate terms. People, though, are still pondering the implications of what has happened. I want to ask David Schoenbrunn, CBS News chief Washington correspondent, how it is seen there.
Charles, one of the very interesting questions under study here in Washington right now is not so much where we go from here, but where does Nikita Khrushchev go? In a strange irony of modern history, there's a suggestion under examination that maybe we ought to worry about how to save Khrushchev. This is the way the reasoning is going. Khrushchev is a devil, but a familiar devil. We now have a lot of experience of how he acts. He played with fire in Cuba, but when we flamed up, he pulled his hand back, even at the cost of a very red face. If he's cast out now, what kind of unknown devil will take over power in Russia? Now, that's just one line of reasoning that I've heard this afternoon. Top analysts are quick to point out that we still do not know just what's been happening in the Kremlin. Did Khrushchev go into Cuba under pressure of hardliners, and can he now say, I told you so, and liquidate his hard men? Or has he himself been a leader of the hard line, and will he go down for failing? One can spell this out ad infinitum. What's important is that our analysts here are studying these questions, carefully examining every possibility in order to make the best guess on what we should do next, and no one is dropping his guard. That is why the public posture of every government official is one of quiet, very quiet satisfaction, no exultation, no rejoicing. In private, however, I can tell you that the top men here are very happy about coming through a terrible, immediate crisis brilliantly. This is David Schoenbrunn in Washington.
I'll be back with the final look at all this in a moment after this message. The danger of war over Cuba seems to have ended with Premier Khrushchev's remarkable letter to President Kennedy. Moreover, it has ended, if it has ended, on our terms, which can only be a victory for United States policy. It can only be read as an humiliating defeat for Soviet policy. So humiliating that the CBS News correspondent in Moscow, Marvin Kalb, as well as David Schoenbrunn, report grave concern over a possible challenge in the labyrinthine politics of the Kremlin to Khrushchev's authority. If the exchange between the president and the premier can be taken at its face value, there is a possibility that the Cuban crisis may mark something more than just a challenge and retreat in the Cold War, but a genuine turning point in modern history. Both have agreed to undertake broad-gauge negotiations. Such negotiations have a way of being inconclusive, but this last week has been a sobering one in all conscience. It is well calculated to compel the world to take a new look at other conflicts even more difficult to solve. This is Charles Collingwood.
This CBS News special report, The Anatomy of a Crisis,